The wind cut through Frank Carter's heavy coat like a knife as he rode across the frozen Wyoming plains. Snow crunched under his horse's hooves with each step, and his breath formed white clouds in the bitter air. It was February 1887, and the winter had been one of the worst anyone could remember. The blizzard that had torn through the territory 3 days ago had finally passed, leaving behind a world painted white and deadly silent. Frank pulled his hat down lower over his weathered face and squinted against the glare of sunlight on snow. At 45 years old, he had spent more than half his life working cattle ranches across the American West. His hands were scarred from rope burns and barbed wire. His back ached from countless hours in the saddle, and his face was carved with lines from 2 decades of sun and wind. But this was the life he had chosen, and despite its hardships, he couldn't imagine doing anything else. He had started this morning before dawn, riding out to check on his cattle spread after the storm. Frank owned a modest ranch about 15 miles outside the small town of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming. It wasn't much compared to some of the big operations, but it was his own land, bought and paid for with years of hard work and careful saving. The ranch supported about 200 head of cattle, enough to make a decent living if the weather cooperated and the market stayed steady, but winters like this, one could wipe out everything a man had worked for. Cattle could freeze to death in a single night if they couldn't find shelter. They could get lost in the blinding snow and wander until they dropped from exhaustion. Worse yet, they could break through thin ice on streams and creeks, drowning in the freezing water below. Frank had already found 6 dead cattle that morning, their bodies frozen solid where they had fallen. It was heartbreaking, but not unexpected. Every rancher in the territory would be counting similar losses when spring finally came. The key was to find the living animals and get them to safety before another storm hit. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, picked his way carefully across the uneven ground. Buck was 15 years old and had been with Frank for nearly a decade. The horse seemed to understand the importance of their mission, stepping cautiously around hidden rocks and testing each footfall on the treacherous surface. As they crested a small hill, Frank spotted movement in the valley below. A small group of cattle had taken shelter in a grove of cottonwood trees near a creek. He felt a surge of relief. These animals had survived the storm and looked to be in decent shape. But as he rode closer, something else caught his attention. About 50 yards from the cattle, near the frozen creek, lay the unmistakable shape of a dead horse. Frank's heart sank. Wild horses sometimes tried to weather bad storms in the same areas as cattle, and they didn't always make it. But as he got closer, he realized this wasn't a wild horse at all. This animal had been wearing a saddle and bridle. Though the leather was now cracked and stiff from the cold, Frank dismounted and approached the dead horse slowly. The animal had been a paint moire, brown and white patches still visible under a thin layer of snow. She had been a good-looking horse, well-fed and cared for until whatever had brought her to this lonely end. Frank knelt down to examine the body more closely, trying to understand what had happened. That's when he saw her. At first, Frank thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The cold and wind could make a man see things that weren't there. But as he moved around to the other side of the dead horse, there was no mistaking what he was looking at. A human figure lay curled up against the animal's body, partially hidden beneath its bulk. Frank's heart started pounding as he rushed forward. The person was small and slight, wrapped in what looked like torn and dirty clothing. Long black hair spilled out from under a makeshift hood, and Frank could see it was a woman. Her face was pale and drawn, her lips blue from the cold. For a terrible moment, he thought she was dead too. He knelt down beside her and placed his gloved hand near her mouth, feeling for breath. A faint warmth touched his fingers. She was alive, but barely. Frank quickly pulled off his glove and pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, weak and irregular, but definitely there. The woman appeared to be Native American, probably in her early 20s. Her clothes were strange, a mixture of traditional Indian dress and white woman's clothing, as if she had been caught between two worlds. Her moccasins were worn through in places, and Frank could see that her feet were badly frostbitten. She had scratches and cuts on her hands and face, suggesting she had been through some kind of ordeal before ending up here. But what struck Frank most was how she had positioned herself. She wasn't just lying near the dead horse by accident. She had deliberately crawled underneath the animal's body, using it as shelter from the wind and snow. The horse's bulk had created a small pocket of relatively warm air, and that pocket had probably saved her life. Frank looked around, trying to piece together what had happened. There were no other tracks in the snow except his own and Buck's. Whatever had brought this woman here had happened before the blizzard, which meant she had been surviving under that dead horse for at least 3 days. He stood up and scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of other people. Nothing. They were completely alone in this frozen wasteland, miles from the nearest settlement. If he hadn't decided to check this particular valley today, she would have died here, and probably no one would have found her body until spring. Frank had heard stories about conflicts between settlers and native tribes in other parts of the territory. There had been raids and counter-raids with innocent people caught in the middle, but he had always tried to stay out of those troubles, focusing on his ranch and his cattle. Looking down at this unconscious woman, he realized that staying neutral was no longer an option. He knelt down again and gently shook her shoulder. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. She mumbled something in a language Frank didn't understand, then fell silent again. There was no time to waste. The woman needed medical attention immediately, and another storm could blow in at any time. Frank carefully slipped his arms under her body and lifted her up. She was lighter than he expected, probably because she hadn't eaten properly in days. Buck snorted nervously as Frank approached with his unexpected cargo. The horse had been trained for ranch work, not rescue missions, but he stood still as Frank figured out how to get the unconscious woman onto his back. Finally, Frank managed to position her in front of the saddle, holding her steady with one arm while he grabbed the reins with the other. The ride back to the ranch seemed to take forever. Frank had to move slowly to avoid jostling his passenger too much, and every few minutes he stopped to check that she was still breathing. The wind picked up as the afternoon wore on, and by the time they reached the ranch house, snow was beginning to fall again. Frank's ranch was a simple but well-built operation. The main house was a 2-story wooden structure with a wide front porch and a stone chimney that was currently sending up a steady stream of smoke. Behind the house stood a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a network of corrals and fences. As Frank rode up to the house, the front door opened and Elena Rodriguez stepped out onto the porch. Elena was a Mexican widow in her 40s who had been working as Frank's housekeeper for the past 5 years. She was a small, energetic woman with graying hair and kind eyes, and Frank trusted her completely. Elena took one look at Frank's burden and immediately understood the situation. Without a word, she hurried down the porch steps to help him get the unconscious woman into the house. Together, they carried her upstairs to the spare bedroom and laid her gently on the bed. "How long has she been out there?" Elena asked in her accented English as she began examining the woman's condition. "At least 3 days, maybe longer," Frank replied. "Found her under a dead horse, using it for shelter." Elena shook her head in amazement. 3 days in this cold? "She's stronger than she looks." As Elena worked to remove the woman's wet, frozen clothing and assess her injuries, Frank stood by the window, looking out at the falling snow. He found himself wondering who this woman was, where she had come from, and what had driven her to risk death in the Wyoming wilderness. Whatever her story was, Frank knew his life had just become much more complicated. Elena Rodriguez moved around the unconscious woman with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with emergencies before. Her small hands worked quickly but gently, checking for injuries while Frank heated water on the kitchen stove. Downstairs, the spare bedroom was modest but clean, with a simple wooden bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the snowy ranch yard. "Her feet are the worst," Elena called down to Frank. "Frostbite, but not as bad as it could be. The horse must have kept her warmer than we thought." Frank climbed the stairs with a basin of warm water and clean towels. Elena had already wrapped the woman in several thick blankets and was working to clean the cuts and scratches on her face and hands. Up close, Frank could see that she was probably younger than he had first thought, maybe early 20s, with high cheekbones and smooth skin despite the ordeal she had been through. "What do you think happened to her?" Frank asked quietly, setting the basin on the dresser. Elena shook her head as she dipped a cloth in the warm water. "Hard to say. Those clothes she was wearing, part Indian, part white woman's dress. Like she was caught between two worlds, and look at her hands." Frank examined the woman's hands as Elena cleaned them. They were small but calloused, showing she was used to hard work. There were rope burns on her palms and what looked like old scars on her knuckles. These weren't the soft hands of someone who had lived an easy life. "She's been through more than just this storm," Elena observed. "These injuries, some of them are older. Someone hurt this girl before she ever got lost in the snow." The woman stirred slightly, mumbling something in a language neither Frank nor Elena understood. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open, and after a moment she was still again. Elena continued her careful examination, finding more bruises on the woman's arms and back that looked several days old. "Frank," Elena said softly, "I think she was running from something, or someone." Frank felt a cold anger building in his chest. He had seen enough violence in his 45 years to recognize the signs of abuse when he saw them. The idea that someone had hurt this young woman badly enough to drive her into the deadly winter landscape made his hands clench into fists. Elena worked through the evening, cleaning wounds, applying salve to the frostbitten areas, and trying to get small amounts of warm broth into the unconscious woman. Frank helped where he could, but mostly he found himself pacing the room, looking out the window at the falling snow and wondering what kind of trouble he might be bringing onto his ranch. By midnight, the woman's breathing had become stronger and more regular. Her color was improving too, though she still hadn't regained consciousness. Elena settled into a chair beside the bed with a cup of coffee, preparing to keep watch through the night. "You should get some sleep," she told Frank. "I'll wake you if anything changes," but Frank couldn't sleep. He spent the night downstairs in his kitchen, drinking coffee and staring into the fire. Every few minutes he would climb the stairs to check on their patient, but Elena always waved him away with a reassuring nod. As dawn broke over the snow-covered ranch, Frank was standing at his kitchen window when he heard Elena calling his name. From upstairs, he took the steps 2 at a time and found Elena leaning over the bed, talking softly to someone who was finally awake. The woman's eyes were open, dark brown, almost black, and filled with fear and confusion. She was trying to sit up, but Elena was gently holding her down. "Easy, child," Elena was saying in her soothing voice. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." The woman's eyes darted to Frank standing in the doorway, and for a moment he saw pure terror flash across her face. She tried to scramble away from him, pressing herself back against the headboard despite Elena's attempts to calm her. "It's all right," Frank said quietly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm the one who found you. You were nearly frozen to death out there." The woman stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she spoke in heavily accented English. "The horse," she whispered, her voice hoarse from cold and dehydration. "Is the horse ... The horse was already dead when I found you," Frank said gently. "You were using it for shelter? Probably saved your life." Tears began to flow down the woman's cheeks, and she turned her face away from them. Elena immediately moved to comfort her, speaking in rapid Spanish. To Frank's surprise, the woman responded in the same language, though her accent was different from Elena's. After a few minutes of conversation, Elena turned to Frank. "Her name is Ayana. She speaks English, Spanish, and her tribal language. She says she learned at a mission school." "Ask her what happened," Frank said. "How did she end up out there alone?" Elena translated the question, and Ayana's response was long and emotional. Elena listened carefully, occasionally asking follow-up questions. Frank could see the anger building in Elena's face as the story unfolded. "She was running," Elena finally explained to Frank. Someone was chasing her. Bad men who wanted to hurt her. She's been traveling for almost a week, trying to get somewhere safe. Where was she trying to go? Frank asked. Another exchange in Spanish, then Elena shook her head. She doesn't know. Just away from wherever she was. Her horse gave out in the storm, died from the cold. She stayed with it because she knew it was her only chance to survive. Frank studied Ayana's face as Elena continued to translate. The young woman was watching him carefully, as if trying to judge his character. There was intelligence in her eyes, and a strength that had clearly helped her survive an ordeal that would have killed most people. Tell her she's welcome to stay. Here until she's better, Frank said. Tell her no one will hurt her while she's under my roof. Elena translated, and for the first time since waking up, Ayana seemed to relax slightly. She nodded and spoke a few words in Spanish. She says thank you, Elena reported. And she says she understands if you want her to leave when she's stronger. She knows it could bring trouble to have her here. Frank frowned. What kind of trouble? Ayana seemed to understand enough English to follow the conversation. She spoke directly to Frank, her voice stronger now. Bad men look for me, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. They come here. Maybe you get hurt. Maybe your woman get hurt, she gestured toward Elena. Elena's not my woman. She's my housekeeper and friend, Frank corrected. And I'm not afraid of bad men? I've dealt with plenty of them in my time. Ayana studied his face for a moment, then nodded slowly. She seemed to make a decision about something. You good man, she said simply. Horse tell me. Frank looked confused. The horse told you. A small smile crossed Ayana's face, the first one Elena or Frank had seen. Dead horse? She was good horse. Take care of me when she could not take care of herself. You find me there, you good man like good horse, Elena smiled too. She's saying that finding you with the horse was a sign that you're trustworthy. Animals choose good people. Over the next few days, as Ayana's strength returned, Frank learned more about their unexpected guest. She was indeed 22 years old, from a Lakota family that had been moved to a reservation in South Dakota. She had attended a mission school for several years, which explained her ability to speak multiple languages and her strange mixture of native and white clothing. But whenever Frank or Elena asked about why she had been running, or who had been chasing her, Ayana would become quiet and withdrawn. It was clear that whatever had happened was too painful or too dangerous to discuss. Frank didn't push for answers. He had learned long ago that people shared their stories when they were ready, and not before. In the meantime, he was content to provide shelter and safety to someone who clearly needed both. What he didn't know was that by taking Ayana in, he had already set in motion a chain of events that would test every principle he believed in and force him to choose between his own safety and doing what was right. The men who were looking for Ayana were not the type to give up easily, and Frank Carter's quiet ranch was about to become the center of a conflict that would change all their lives forever. 2 weeks after Frank had found Ayana under the dead horse, she was finally strong enough to leave her bed for more than a few minutes at a time. Her frostbitten feet were healing well under Elena's careful treatment, though she still walked with a slight limp. The cuts and bruises on her face had faded, revealing the natural beauty that had been hidden by her ordeal. Frank watched from the kitchen window as Ayana slowly made her way across the ranch yard, testing her strength. She moved differently than most women he knew, with a quiet awareness of her surroundings that reminded him of the way wild animals carried themselves. Her head was constantly turning, checking for threats, listening for sounds that didn't belong. She's getting stronger, Elena observed, joining Frank at the window. But she's still scared of something, Frank nodded. In the 2 weeks since Ayana had been conscious, she had slowly shared more details about her life, but always seemed to hold back when the conversation turned to why she had been running. She had told them about growing up on the Pine Ridge Reservation, about her years at the mission school, and about her family. But whenever Frank asked about more recent events, she would change the subject or find an excuse to leave the room. What Ayana had shared was impressive enough. She could read and write in 3 languages, had learned mathematics and history alongside traditional skills like tracking and plant medicine. The mission school had tried to erase her native identity, but her grandmother had secretly taught her the old ways during summer visits. She was caught between two worlds, equally comfortable speaking English in a schoolroom or identifying medicinal plants on the prairie. "Frank," Elena said quietly, "I think we need to be prepared for trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Elena was quiet for a moment, watching Ayana examine the horses in the corral. "Yesterday, when I was in town getting supplies, people were asking questions about why you haven't been seen much lately, about whether you were hiding something." At the ranch, Frank felt his jaw tighten. Cedar Ridge was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. He had hoped to keep Ayana's presence quiet until she was ready to decide what to do next, but apparently word was already spreading. "What kind of questions?" "Sheriff Wilson asked me directly if you had taken in any strangers," Elena replied. "I told him you had found an injured traveler, but he wanted to know more details. He seemed especially interested when I mentioned she was a woman." Frank cursed under his breath. Sheriff Ben Wilson was a decent enough man, but he was also under pressure from the territorial government to keep the peace between settlers and the various native tribes in the area. There had been tensions lately, with reports of cattle rustling and property disputes that some people blamed on reservation Indians. "Did you tell him she was native?" Elena shook her head. "I wasn't sure if I should. But Frank, if she's running from something serious, it might be better to involve the law." Frank watched Ayana approach one of his horses, a temperamental stallion named Thunder that usually didn't let strangers near him. To his amazement, the horse immediately calmed under her gentle touch, allowing her to stroke his neck and whisper to him in her native language. "Look at that," Frank murmured. "Thunder hasn't let anyone except me touch him in 3 years." They watched as Ayana continued to work with the horse, her movements confident and natural. It was clear she had grown up around animals and understood them in a way that couldn't be taught in any school. "She's not just any runaway," Frank said finally. "Someone with her education and skills doesn't end up nearly frozen to death in the middle of nowhere unless something very bad happened." As if sensing their conversation, Ayana looked up toward the house and waved. Frank waved back, then made a decision. "I'm going to talk to her," he told Elena. "We need to know what we're dealing with." Frank walked out to the corral where Ayana was still working with Thunder. The horse was now eating apple slices from her hand, completely relaxed in her presence. "He likes you," Frank observed. Ayana smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Animals know when people have good hearts or bad hearts. This horse he has been hurt before, but he still wants to trust." Frank leaned against the fence, studying her face. "Is that why you don't want to talk about what happened to you? Because someone with a bad heart hurt you?" The smile faded from Ayana's face, and she turned back to the horse. For a long moment, Frank thought she wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at him, she began to speak. "At the reservation there is a man," she said quietly. "Government man, supposed to help our people, but he helps only himself." Frank waited patiently for her to continue. "His name is Thomas Brennan. He controls the food, the supplies, everything we need to survive. If you make him angry, your family starves. If you are a young woman and you make him angry—" She trailed off, her hands stilling on the horse's neck. "He hurt you," Frank said. "It wasn't a question." Ayana nodded slowly. "He wanted me to be his woman. Said if I refused, my family would be sent away from the reservation with nothing. In the winter, that means death." Frank felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "So you agreed?" "I pretended to agree," Ayana replied, "but I was planning to escape. My grandmother, before she died, she told me about places where our people could hide. Old trails, sacred places the white men don't know about. What went wrong?" Ayana was quiet for so long that Frank thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There was another girl, younger than me, only 16. Brennan grew tired of waiting for me, so he took her instead." Ayana's hands clenched into fists. She tried to fight him. He killed her, made it look like an accident. Frank felt sick. And you saw this happen? I saw him bring her body back to the reservation. He said she fell from her horse, hit her head on a rock. But I saw the bruises on her neck, the fear still in her eyes. Ayanna turned to face Frank directly. I knew if I stayed, I would be next, so I stole a horse and ran, and he followed you. He sent men after me. Found me twice, but I got away. The last time they shot my horse. That's how I ended up under the dead Murrah. She was carrying me when they found us. She died trying to save me. Frank understood now why Ayanna had been so frightened when she first woke up, why she constantly watched for threats. She wasn't just running from an unwanted marriage, she was running for her life. This Brennan, Frank said carefully, does he know you're alive? Ayanna shrugged. Maybe yes, maybe no. The storm covered my tracks. But men like him, they don't give up easy. Too much pride. Frank looked back toward the house, where Elena was hanging laundry on the line. His quiet ranch life suddenly seemed very fragile. Ayanna, he said, I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever comes, Elena and I will protect you. She studied his face for a long moment. You are a good man, Frank Carter, but you don't understand what kind of enemy this is. Brennan has the law on his side, has government papers that say he can do what he wants. If he comes here, you cannot fight him with guns. Then how do we fight him? For the first time since she had started telling her story, Ayanna smiled again. We fight him with truth. But first, we must survive long enough to tell it. Over the following days, Frank noticed changes in the routine around Cedar Ridge. When he rode into town for supplies, conversations stopped when he walked into the general store. Men he had known for years avoided his eyes or gave him curt nods. Instead of their usual friendly greetings, the situation came to a head one afternoon when Sheriff Wilson rode out to the ranch. Frank was working in the barn when he heard the horse approaching. Through the open door, he could see the sheriff's familiar figure dismounting near the house. Elena met Wilson at the front door, and Frank could hear the murmur of conversation, though he couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes, Elena called his name. Frank walked over to find Wilson standing on his front porch, hat in hand but expression serious. Frank, Wilson said with a nod, we need to talk. About what? About the Indian woman you're harboring. There are concerns in town, and I've received some inquiries from territorial authorities. Frank felt his muscles tense. What kind of inquiries? Wilson shifted uncomfortably. There's a federal agent named Brennan looking for a runaway from the Pine Ridge Reservation. Young native woman, considered dangerous? He says she stole government property and may be connected to some recent troubles in the area. Frank kept his expression neutral, though inside he was seething. So Brennan had tracked Ayanna this far and was using his official position to pressure local law enforcement. I haven't seen any federal agents, Frank said carefully. He's not here yet, but he's coming. Frank, I've known you for 10 years. You're a good man, but you're also stubborn as a mule when you think you're doing right. Don't let that stubbornness get you into trouble you can't handle. Wilson put his hat back on and turned to leave, then paused. Whatever you're mixed up in, it's bigger than you think. Be careful. As Frank watched the sheriff ride away, he realized that their time of peace was coming to an end. Brennan was closing in, and soon Frank would have to choose between his own safety and protecting the woman who had become like family to him. The choice, he knew, had already been made. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow and revealing the green grass beneath. As the weeks passed, Ayanna grew stronger and more comfortable around the ranch. Frank watched her transform from the frightened, half-frozen woman he had found under the dead horse into someone who moved with confidence and purpose. Every morning, Ayanna would rise before dawn and help Elena with the household chores. But it was her work with the animals that truly amazed Frank. She had a natural gift that went beyond anything he had seen in his 20 years of ranching. Horses that had been stubborn and difficult became calm and cooperative under her care. Cattle that had been skittish after the harsh winter began to trust her presence. Watch this, Frank said to Elena one morning as they stood by the kitchen window. Ayana was in the corral with a young mare that had been injured during the blizzard. The horse had been limping for weeks, favoring her right front leg, and Frank had been considering whether to put her down. Ayana knelt beside the mare, her hands moving gently along the animal's leg. She spoke to the horse in her native language, her voice low and soothing. Gradually, the mare relaxed and allowed Ayana to examine the injury more closely. "She's finding something the vet missed," Elena observed. Frank nodded. 3 days earlier, the traveling veterinarian had examined the mare and declared that the leg was probably broken and would never heal properly. But Ayana had insisted that the injury was different from what it appeared to be. As they watched, Ayana pulled something from her medicine pouch, a collection of herbs and roots she had gathered during her walks around the ranch. She mixed them with water from the horse trough and applied the mixture to the mare's leg, wrapping it carefully with strips of cloth. "My grandmother taught me this," Ayana had explained to Frank the day before. "White medicine looks at what is broken. Indian medicine looks at what needs to heal." Frank had been skeptical, but he was willing to try anything to save the horse. Now, watching the mare stand more comfortably than she had in weeks, he was beginning to understand that Ayana's knowledge went far deeper than anything taught in schools. Over the following days, the mare's improvement was remarkable. She began putting weight on the injured leg, and within a week she was walking normally. Word of the miracle cure spread quickly among the ranch hands, and soon they were bringing other injured animals to Ayana for treatment. "She's got a gift," said Jake Thompson, Frank's longest-serving ranch hand. Jake was a grizzled cowboy in his 50s who had worked cattle across 3 states. "Never seen anything like it. That mare was done for, and now look at her." But it wasn't just her skill with animals that impressed the ranch workers. Ayana could track wounded cattle through terrain that would stump experienced hunters. She could predict weather changes hours before they happened, reading signs in the clouds and wind that others missed. And her knowledge of edible and medicinal plants was encyclopedic. "She's teaching me things I never knew," Elena confided to Frank. One evening as they watched Ayana help prepare dinner, "Plants that grow right here on your land that can cure fever, stop bleeding, ease pain." The mission school tried to take all that knowledge away from her people, but her grandmother made sure she remembered. Frank found himself spending more and more time talking with Ayana as she worked around the ranch. Her intelligence was obvious, but it was her perspective on the world that fascinated him. She saw connections between things that he had never considered, understood the balance between humans and nature in ways that challenged his assumptions. "You treat your land well," she told him one afternoon as they checked on a herd of cattle in the far pasture. "Many white ranchers take everything and give nothing back. But your animals are healthy, your grass is strong, you listen to what the land tells you." Frank felt a flush of pride at her words. He had always tried to be a responsible steward of his property, but her approval meant more to him than he expected. "My father taught me that," he replied. "Said a man who fights against the land will always lose in the end." "Better to work with?" Ayana smiled. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "In my tribe, we say the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth." As they talked, Frank learned more about Ayana's life before the terrible events that had driven her to flee. She had been one of the brightest students at the mission school, learning to read and write English better than many white children. But she had also secretly maintained her connection to traditional ways, learning from her grandmother during summer visits home. "The teachers said our old ways were savage, that we had to forget everything to become civilized," Ayana explained. "But my grandmother said wisdom comes from many sources. She taught me to take the best from both worlds." Frank could see the evidence of that philosophy in everything Ayana did. She could discuss literature and mathematics with the education of a white woman, but she could also read the landscape and understand animal behavior with knowledge that went back generations. But despite their growing friendship, Frank could sense that Ayana was still holding back parts of her story. Whenever their conversations touched on her time at the reservation before she fled, she would become quiet and withdrawn. There were details about Thomas Brennan and what had happened to the young girl who died that she had not shared. The truth began to emerge during a conversation with Elena. Frank had noticed that the two women spent long hours talking in Spanish, and he suspected that Ayana felt more comfortable sharing sensitive information in a language that felt less connected to her traumatic experiences. "Frank," Elena said one evening after Ayana had gone to bed, "there's more to this story than she's told you." "What do you mean?" Elena glanced toward the stairs to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "The girl who died, her name was Little Dove. She wasn't just some random victim. She was Ayana's younger sister." Frank felt his blood run cold. "Her sister? Half-sister, actually? Same mother, different fathers." Ayana had been protecting her for years, ever since their mother died. When Brennan started pressuring Ayana to become his woman, she agreed partly to keep him away from Little Dove. Frank sank into his chair, understanding now why Ayana's pain ran so deep. So when she refused him, he took her sister instead, and when Little Dove fought back, he killed her. Elena's voice was tight with anger. "But here's the part that makes it worse. Ayana saw it happen." "She witnessed the murder?" Elena nodded. She had followed them, hoping to help her sister escape. She saw Brennan strangle Little Dove with his own hands, then arrange the body to make it look like a riding accident. She's not just running because she's afraid of him. She's running because she's the only witness to his crime. Frank stared into the fire, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. That's why he's so determined to find her. It's not just about his wounded pride or getting her back. She could destroy him. Exactly. And Frank, there's something else. Ayana told me she's not the only woman he's hurt. There have been others over the years, women who disappeared, women who died in accidents, but they were all isolated incidents. On the reservation where his word was law. No one ever had proof. Frank stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful ranch yard. Somewhere out there, a predator was hunting the woman who had become like family to him. But now he understood that this wasn't just about protecting one person. It was about stopping a killer who had been using his government position to prey on vulnerable women for years. "Elena," he said quietly, "we need to be ready for anything. If Brennan is willing to kill to keep his secrets, he won't hesitate to come after all of us." Elena nodded. "Ayana knows that. She's been trying to decide whether to leave, to protect us from the danger she's brought here." Frank turned back. "To face her. And what did you tell her?" "I told her that good people don't run away when evil men threaten them. I told her that you would never forgive yourself if you let her face this alone." Elena paused. "I hope I was right." Frank looked toward the stairs, thinking about the remarkable woman sleeping in the room above. She had survived a winter that should have killed her, witnessed a murder that could destroy a powerful man, and found the courage to keep fighting when most people would have given up. "You were right," he said finally. "Ayana belongs here now. And if Brennan wants to take her away, he'll have to go through all of us." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding Frank that spring in Wyoming could be just as dangerous as winter. Storms could appear without warning, and a man had to be ready for anything the weather might bring, but the approaching storm they faced now wasn't made of wind and snow. It was made of corruption and violence, and it was heading straight for their quiet ranch with the determination of a man who had too much to lose to give up without a fight. The morning Frank had been dreading arrived on a Tuesday in late April. He was breaking horses in the corral when Jake Thompson came riding hard from the direction of town, dust kicking up behind his horse. Frank could tell from the way Jake was pushing his mount that something was seriously wrong. "Boss!" Jake called out as he reined in his horse near the fence. "We got trouble coming, big trouble." Frank climbed down from the horse he had been training and walked over to Jake. "What kind of trouble?" "There's a federal agent in town asking questions about you and the Indian woman. Sheriff Wilson sent me out to warn you." Jake wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "This ain't no ordinary lawman, Frank. He's got papers, got deputies with him, and he's talking like he owns the whole territory." Frank felt his stomach drop. After weeks of relative peace, Thomas Brennan had finally tracked them down. "How many men does he have with him?" 4 deputies, all armed to the teeth. Plus, there's talk that more are coming from the territorial capital. Jake glanced toward the house where Ayanna was helping Elena hang laundry. Frank, this man Brennan, he's not just looking to arrest her. The way he was talking in the saloon last night, he wants her dead. What was he saying? Jake lowered his voice. He told folks she's a dangerous criminal who killed a white woman on the reservation. Says she's been stirring up trouble among the tribes, trying to start some kind of uprising. Claims she stole government property and assaulted federal officers when they tried to arrest her. Frank clenched his fists. Every word out of Brennan's mouth was a lie designed to turn the local population against Ayanna. In the current climate of fear about Indian troubles, such accusations would be taken seriously by most settlers. Did anyone believe him? Jake shrugged. Some did, some didn't. But Frank, it don't matter what people believe. He's got federal authority, and he's got enough men to take her by force if he wants to. Frank looked toward the house again, where Ayanna was now hanging sheets on the line. She moved with the same careful awareness she always showed, but he could tell from her posture that she sensed something was wrong. 3 months of living together had taught him to read her moods and reactions. How long do we have? Frank asked. Hour. Maybe 2? He was gathering his men when I left town, checking his weapons and making sure everyone understood their orders. Jake paused. Frank, I've been working for you for 8 years and I've never questioned your judgment. But this is different. This is the federal government we're talking about. Frank nodded, understanding the position Jake was in. I'm not asking you to fight the government, Jake. This is my choice to make. But before Jake could respond, Ayanna appeared at Frank's side. She had approached so quietly that neither man had heard her coming, a skill that still amazed Frank after all these weeks. He's here, she said simply, the bad man from my dreams. I can feel him getting closer. Frank looked at her with concern. Over the past month, Ayanna had occasionally mentioned dreams or visions about Brennan finding her. At first, Frank had assumed they were just nightmares caused by her trauma. But her intuition about danger had proven accurate too many times for him to dismiss her concerns. Ayanna, I want you to go inside and pack only what you need, Frank said. Elena's got the buckboard ready in the barn. If things go bad, I want you both to head for the Morrison place up north. Old Pete Morrison won't ask questions, and he's got enough sons to hold off a small army. Ayanna shook her head. No running, I'm tired of running. This isn't running, it's being smart. Brennan's got legal authority and armed men. We can't fight the federal government head-on. You don't understand? Ayanna said, her voice stronger than Frank had ever heard it. If I keep running, he will keep chasing. And he will hurt more women, kill more innocent people. It has to stop here. Frank stared at her, seeing a determination in her eyes that hadn't been there when he first found her. The frightened young woman who had been hiding under a dead horse was gone, replaced by someone who had found the courage to face her demons. Ayanna, if you stay and he takes you, you'll disappear forever. No one will ever know what really happened to you. She smiled, but it was a sad expression. Maybe it's time for the truth to come out. Maybe someone needs to stand up to him, even if it costs everything. Jake cleared his throat. Ma'am. With respect, standing up to a federal agent with a warrant ain't brave, it's suicide. Frank's right, you should get out of here while you can. But Elena had joined them, having overheard the conversation. She's not going anywhere, the older woman said firmly. And neither am I. Frank turned to stare at his housekeeper. Elena, this isn't your fight. Yes, it is, Elena replied. I've seen what men like Brennan do to women who can't defend themselves. My own sister was murdered by a corrupt official in Mexico, a man who knew the law would never touch him because he was connected to powerful people. Elena's revelation stunned Frank. In 5 years of working together, she had never mentioned having a sister, much less one who had been murdered. That's why I came north, Elena continued. That's why I'll never go back to Mexico. I swore on my sister's grave that I would never again stand by and watch evil men hurt innocent women. Frank looked around at the 3 people who had become his family. Jake was clearly torn between loyalty and self-preservation. Elena was determined to fight regardless of the odds, and Ayanna had made peace with whatever fate awaited her. "There has to be another way," Frank said. "Some way to expose Brennan without getting everyone killed?" Ayanna touched his arm gently. "Frank, you saved my life when you found me under that horse. But saving my life doesn't mean keeping me breathing forever. Sometimes saving someone means helping them do what's right, even when it's dangerous." Before Frank could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching from the direction of town. 5 riders were coming down the main road toward the ranch, moving at a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. "That's them," Jake said, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "The big man in the black coat, that's Brennan." Frank studied the approaching riders through narrowed eyes. Thomas Brennan was indeed a large man, tall and broad-shouldered, riding an expensive-looking black horse. Even at a distance, there was something about his posture that spoke of arrogance and entitlement. The 4 men with him looked like professional gunfighters rather than legitimate law enforcement officers. "Elena, get inside and load the shotgun," Frank said quietly. "Jake, you're not obligated to stay for this. Take your horse and ride out the back way if you want." Jake spat into the dust. "Hell, Frank, I may not understand what's going on here, but I've never run from a fight in my life. Ain't starting now." Frank felt a surge of gratitude for his loyal foreman. "Then get your rifle and take a position in the barn where you can cover the front yard." As Jake headed for the barn and Elena went inside, Frank and Ayanna stood side by side watching the approaching riders. Frank's hand rested on the grip of his Colt revolver, while Ayanna remained outwardly calm despite the danger bearing down on them. "Frank," she said softly, "whatever happens, I want you to know that these have been the happiest months of my life. For the first time since my grandmother died, I felt like I had a real family." Frank looked down at her, this remarkable woman, who had survived so much and still found the strength to care about others. "Ayanna, we are family, and families protect each other." The riders were close enough now that Frank could see Brennan's face clearly. It was a hard face, with cold eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently set in a sneer. This was a man who was used to getting what he wanted through intimidation and violence. Brennan raised his hand, signaling his men to stop about 30 yards from the house. He dismounted and walked forward alone, his coat pushed back to reveal the badge pinned to his vest and the gun on his hip. "Frank Carter?" Brennan called out in a voice that carried easily across the yard. "That's me," Frank replied, not moving from his position. "I'm Federal Agent Thomas Brennan. I have a warrant for the arrest of the Indian woman you're harboring. Send her out, and there won't be any trouble." Frank felt Ayanna tense beside him, but she didn't move. What's she accused of? Frank called back. Brennan smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Murder, theft of government property, and conspiracy to incite rebellion among the tribal populations. She's a dangerous criminal, Mr. Carter, and anyone who aids her is breaking federal law." "Funny thing," Frank replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The woman I know couldn't hurt a fly. Spends her time healing injured animals and helping my housekeeper with chores. Doesn't sound much like a murderer to me." Brennan's smile faded. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to give you one chance to do this the easy way. Send the woman out now, and I'll overlook your interference. Refuse and I'll arrest you as an accessory to her crimes." Frank took a step forward, his hand still resting on his gun. "And I'm going to give you one chance, Brennan. Get off my property. And don't come back. Whatever lies you've been telling in town, I'm not buying them." The federal agent's face darkened with anger. "You're making a serious mistake, Carter. I have legal authority here, and I have enough men to take what I came." "Oh, or maybe," Frank said. "But it won't be as easy as you think." The silence stretched across the ranch yard like a taut rope ready to snap. Frank could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he stared down Thomas Brennan, the federal agent who had come to destroy everything he cared about. Behind him, he sensed Ayanna's steady presence, her breathing calm despite the mortal danger they all faced. Brennan turned slightly and gestured to his 4 deputies, who immediately spread out in a practice formation. These weren't ordinary lawmen, Frank realized. They moved like professional gunfighters, men who had been in similar situations many times before. Their hands rested casually near their weapons, and their eyes constantly scanned for threats and escape routes. "Last chance, Carter," Brennan called out, his voice carrying a note of finality. "I count 4 of you against 5 of us. Those aren't good odds for a stubborn rancher and a few hired hands." Frank glanced toward the barn where Jake was positioned with his rifle. His foreman caught his eye and nodded slightly, indicating he was ready for whatever came next. From the house, Frank could see the barrel of Elena's shotgun protruding from a window, steady as a rock despite the danger. "Maybe the odds aren't as bad as you think," Frank replied. "And maybe you don't know what you're really up against here." Brennan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. A washed-up cowboy who thinks he can play hero, a Mexican woman who should mind her own business, and a murderous Indian squaw who's been filling your head with lies." The contempt in Brennan's voice when he spoke about Ayanna made Frank's blood boil. This was a man who saw other human beings as objects to be used and discarded, who felt entitled to take whatever he wanted by force. "The only liar here is you, Brennan," Frank said, his voice steady despite his anger. "Ayanna told me what really happened to her sister. How you killed little Div when she wouldn't submit to you." For just a moment, Brennan's confident mask slipped, and Frank saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "That little savage fell from her horse, tragic accident. And if this one had any sense, she'd have kept her mouth shut about it." "She saw you strangle her sister with your own hands," Frank continued, watching Brennan's reaction carefully. "Then you arranged the body to make it look like an accident. But you made one mistake. You left a witness." Brennan's hand moved closer to his gun. "Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, who would believe the word of an Indian woman against a federal agent, especially one who's wanted for murder herself?" "Maybe more people than you think," Frank replied. "Especially when they hear the whole story." From her position beside Frank, Ayanna spoke for the first time since Brennan had arrived. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the yard to reach all the men present. "Thomas Brennan," she said, using his full name like an accusation. "You killed my sister because she fought against your evil. You killed others before her, women whose families were too afraid to speak out, but I am not afraid anymore." Brennan's face twisted with rage. "You're about to be very afraid, you little savage. When I'm done with you, you'll wish you had died under that horse in the snow." The threat was so vicious, so filled with promise of violence, that even Brennan's own men looked uncomfortable. Frank realized that these deputies might not know the full truth about their boss's crimes. "You hear that, boys?" Frank called out to Brennan's men. "Your boss just threatened to torture a woman. That sound like lawful behavior to you?" One of the deputies, a younger man with uncertain eyes, glanced nervously at Brennan. "Agent Brennan, maybe we should just arrest her and let the courts sort this out." Brennan whirled on his subordinate. "You'll do what I tell you to do, Deputy Williams. And what I'm telling you is that this woman is a dangerous criminal who will resist arrest. If she gets hurt in the process, that's her own fault." Frank saw his opportunity and pressed forward. "What he's really telling you is that he plans to murder her to cover up his own crimes. How many of you signed up to help a killer avoid justice?" The seed of doubt Frank had planted began to grow among Brennan's men. They exchanged glances, and Frank could see uncertainty replacing blind obedience. These men might be willing to arrest a fugitive, but participating in cold-blooded murder was something else entirely. Brennan sensed the shift in his men's loyalty and knew he was losing control of the situation. "Enough talk," he snarled, his hand moving to his gun. "I'm taking that woman one way or another." But before Brennan could draw his weapon, another voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Everyone turned to see a new rider approaching from the direction of town. The man was tall and lean, wearing a blue cavalry uniform with officer's insignia. Behind him rode 6 more soldiers, all armed and alert. Frank didn't recognize the officer, but the authority in his voice was unmistakable. Brennan's face went pale as he recognized the newcomer. "Captain Morrison, what are you doing here?" The cavalry officer dismounted and walked forward, his hand resting on his saber. "I'm here on official business, Agent Brennan. I've been investigating reports of irregularities in the administration of Indian affairs in this territory." Frank felt a surge of hope. If this Captain Morrison was investigating Brennan's activities, then maybe there was a chance for justice. "After all, I have a federal warrant," Brennan said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This is outside your jurisdiction, Captain." Morrison smiled coldly. "Actually, Agent Brennan, when it comes to crimes committed against Native Americans under federal supervision, the Army has very clear jurisdiction. And I've been hearing some very interesting stories about your methods." Ayanna stepped forward, moving past Frank to face the cavalry officer directly. "Captain Morrison, I am Ayanna of the Lakota people. I have testimony to give about crimes committed by this man." Morrison nodded respectfully. "Miss Ayanna, I've been hoping to speak with you. Your courage in coming forward has already helped expose a pattern of corruption that goes far beyond one reservation." Brennan's confident facade was crumbling rapidly. "This is outrageous. I'm a federal agent conducting official business. You have no right to interfere." "I have every right," Morrison replied firmly. "Especially when that official business involves covering up murder and assault." He gestured to his soldiers, who moved to surround Brennan's group. "Thomas Brennan, you are under arrest for abuse of authority, corruption, and suspicion of murder." The deputy who had questioned Brennan earlier immediately raised his hands and stepped away from his boss. "Captain, we didn't know what he was really doing. We thought we were arresting a fugitive." Morrison nodded. "Deputy Williams, isn't it? Don't worry. My investigation has already cleared you and most of Agent Brennan's subordinates. You were following orders based on false information." But Brennan wasn't finished. With his authority stripped away and his crimes exposed, he had nothing left to lose. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking that Indian witch with me." Brennan's hand flashed to his gun, drawing it with surprising speed. But Frank had been expecting something like this. Years of dangerous work had given him reflexes that kicked in automatically when violence erupted. Frank's own gun cleared leather in one smooth motion, and his shot rang out across the ranch yard before Brennan could complete his draw. The federal agent's weapon spun from his hand as Frank's bullet struck his wrist, sending him to his knees, clutching his injured arm. "That's enough killing," Frank said, his gun still trained on Brennan. "The man's finished. No need to make it worse." Captain Morrison and his soldiers quickly moved in to secure Brennan, who was cursing and threatening everyone within hearing. The other deputies had already surrendered their weapons and were cooperating fully with the investigation. As the immediate danger passed, Frank felt Ayanna's hand touch his arm. When he looked down at her, he saw tears streaming down her face, not tears of fear, but of relief and vindication. "It's over," she whispered. "Little Dove can finally rest in peace." Elena emerged from the house, still carrying her shotgun, but smiling broadly. Jake came out of the barn, shaking his head in amazement at how quickly the situation had changed. "Frank," Captain Morrison said, approaching with an expression of respect, "I want to thank you for protecting Miss Ayanna. Without her testimony, we might never have been able to expose the full extent of Brennan's crimes." Frank holstered his gun and put his arm around Ayanna's shoulders. "She's been through enough, Captain. I hope this means she can finally have some peace." Morrison nodded. "More than peace, Mr. Carter. Miss Ayanna's courage is going to help a lot of other people get justice. Brennan's been running a network of corruption that affected multiple reservations. Her willingness to speak out is going to bring down the whole operation." As the soldiers led Brennan away, his threats and curses echoing across the ranch yard, Frank realized that the nightmare was truly over. The woman he had found nearly frozen under a dead horse had not only survived her ordeal, she had found the strength to ensure that no other woman would suffer the same fate. The ranch that had been a refuge was about to become something more. A place where justice had been served and where three people from different Worlds had learned that family isn't about blood, but about standing together when it matters most. As the dust settled and Brennan was led away in shackles, Captain Morrison approached Frank with an expression of genuine respect. The cavalry officer was younger than Frank had first thought, probably in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. "Mr. Carter," Morrison said, extending his hand, "I owe you a considerable debt of gratitude. What you did here today took real courage." Frank shook the captain's hand, still trying to process how quickly everything had changed. An hour ago, he had been facing down 5 armed men with little hope of survival. Now those same men were either under arrest or cooperating with a federal investigation. "Captain, I'm grateful for your timing, but I have to ask, how did you know to come here?" Morrison smiled. "That's a longer story than you might expect. Why don't we sit down somewhere and I'll explain everything." Elena, ever the hostess despite the morning's drama, appeared at Frank's elbow. "Captain, you and your men are welcome to water your horses and rest. I'll put coffee on and see what I can manage for lunch." "That's very kind, ma'am," Morrison replied with a tip of his hat. "My men would appreciate that." As Elena bustled off to organize refreshments for the unexpected guests, Morrison settled into one of the chairs on Frank's front porch. Ayanna sat beside Frank, her hands still trembling slightly from the morning's events. Jake positioned himself nearby, clearly curious to hear the captain's explanation. "The truth is," Morrison began, "I've been tracking Brennan's activities for almost 6 months. It started when my commanding officer received a letter from a missionary named Father Joseph at the Pine Ridge Reservation. He was reporting suspicious deaths among the native women under Brennan's authority." Frank felt Ayanna tense beside him. "Father Joseph," she whispered. "He was my teacher at the mission school." "A good man who tried to help our people," Morrison nodded. "Father Joseph mentioned you specifically in his letter, Miss Ayanna. He was worried about your safety and that of your sister. He said Brennan had been pressuring you both, and he feared what might happen if someone didn't intervene." "But we heard nothing from the army," Ayanna said, confusion clear in her voice. "No one came to help." Morrison's expression darkened. "That's because Brennan intercepted Father Joseph's letters. We only received them after Father Joseph died in what was reported as a riding accident." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. "Brennan killed a priest?" "We believe so, though we can't prove it yet. Father Joseph's death was the final piece. That convinced my superiors to authorize a full investigation." Morrison turned to face Ayanna directly. "Miss Ayanna, Father Joseph's last letter mentioned that you had witnessed something that could expose Brennan's crimes. He was trying to arrange safe passage for you and your sister when he died." Ayanna closed her eyes, and Frank could see tears beginning to form. "He was trying to save us, and Brennan killed him for it. Which is why your survival is so important," Morrison continued. "You're not just a witness to your sister's murder, you're the key to exposing an entire network of corruption that spans multiple reservations and involves several federal officials." Frank leaned forward in his chair. "You mean Brennan wasn't working alone?" "Unfortunately, no. He was part of a group of agents and administrators who have been systematically abusing their authority for years. They've been stealing supplies meant for the reservations, selling them for personal profit, and silencing anyone who tried to report their crimes." Jake spat into the dust. "And they figured Indian women would be easy targets because no one would believe their word against federal agents." Morrison nodded grimly. "Exactly. They were counting on the fact that native testimony isn't valued in most courts, and that the isolation of the reservations would prevent word from getting out." "But you said this investigation has been going on for months," Frank said. "Why? Did it take so long to find Ayanna?" "Because we didn't know she was alive," Morrison replied. "Brennan reported that both you and your sister had died in a blizzard while attempting to flee the reservation. He even produced witnesses who claimed to have found your bodies." Ayanna's face went pale. "He had people lie about finding our bodies?" "Some of his own men, deputies who were either corrupt themselves or too frightened to contradict him." "When We started investigating. We discovered that several other women who had tried to report Brennan's crimes had also allegedly died in accidents or while trying to flee. Elena returned with a tray of coffee and some freshly baked bread. As she served the captain, she spoke up. "How many women are we talking about, Captain?" Morrison accepted the coffee gratefully. "We've identified at least 12 suspicious deaths over the past 3 years. All women who had either filed complaints against federal agents or were known to be considering doing so." The number hit Frank like a punch to the stomach. 12 women dead because they had tried to seek justice. And Ayanna had come within hours of being the 13th. What changed? Frank asked. "How did you figure out that Ayanna was still alive?" Morrison smiled for the first time since he had started his explanation. "Pure chance, actually. One of my men was in Cedar Ridge last week buying supplies when he overheard some cowboys talking about a rancher who had taken in an Indian woman. The description matched what we knew about you, Miss Ayanna." "But why didn't you come directly to the ranch?" Frank asked. "Why wait until Brennan showed up?" "Because we needed Brennan to incriminate himself. All we had was suspicions and circumstantial evidence. We needed him to make a move that would expose his true intentions." Morrison looked apologetic. "I'm sorry we had to put you all at risk, but we had to catch him in the act of trying to silence a witness." Ayanna had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. "Captain Morrison, what happened to the other deputies who worked with Brennan? Are they all corrupt?" "Most of them were just following orders without understanding what they were really involved in. Men like Deputy Williams, who questioned Brennan's methods today, are actually helping us build our case. They're providing testimony about orders they received that didn't seem right at the time." Jake scratched his head. "So what happens now? Is this whole mess finally over?" Morrison set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair. "The immediate danger is over, yes. Brennan is under arrest and will face trial for multiple murders. But the larger investigation is just beginning. We'll need Miss Ayanna's testimony to help us identify other victims and build cases against Brennan's accomplices." Frank looked at Ayanna with concern. "That means more time in courtrooms, more people questioning your story, more chances for dangerous men to try to silence you." "I know," Ayanna replied quietly. "But it also means that Little Dove's death will have meaning, and maybe no other. Woman will have to go through what we did." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Miss Ayanna, I want you to know that you'll have full Army protection during the legal proceedings. And after the trials are over, you'll be free to go wherever you choose, back to your people or somewhere else entirely." "What about Frank and Elena?" Ayanna asked. "They saved my life and put themselves in danger for me. Will they be safe?" "Absolutely. In fact, Mr. Carter's actions today make him a hero in the eyes of the federal government. He protected a key witness at great personal risk and helped expose a major corruption scandal." Frank felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what any decent person would do." "Maybe," Morrison replied. "But not everyone has the courage to stand up to armed federal agents, even when they know those agents are corrupt. What you did took real backbone." As the afternoon wore on, Morrison and his men prepared to leave, taking Brennan and the evidence they had gathered back to the territorial capital. Before mounting his horse, the captain had one final conversation with Frank. "Mr. Carter, I want you to know that Miss Ayanna couldn't have found a better protector. What you've given her, safety, dignity, a chance to heal, that's something special." Frank looked over at Ayanna, who was saying goodbye to one of Morrison's soldiers who had known her father. "She gave us more than we gave her, Captain." "She brought life to this place," Morrison smiled knowingly. "I noticed the way you look at her, Mr. Carter, and the way she looks at you. I'd say this story might have a happy ending after all." As the soldiers rode away with their prisoner, Frank stood on his porch watching Ayanna work with the horses in the corral. She moved with the same grace and confidence she had always shown, but there was something different about her now. The fear that had shadowed her for months was finally gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and hope. The woman he had found nearly dead under a horse in the snow had not only survived, She had found the strength to bring down a network of killers and give voice to the voiceless. And in the process, she had transformed his lonely ranch into something that felt like a real home. Frank knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. 6 months later, Frank stood in the courtroom in Cheyenne, watching as the judge delivered the final verdict in Thomas Brennan's trial. The former federal agent sat slumped in his chair, his arrogance finally broken after weeks of devastating testimony from Ayanna and nearly a dozen other witnesses who had come forward once word spread that someone was finally listening. "Thomas Brennan," the judge declared in a voice that carried to every corner of the packed courtroom, "you have been found guilty of murder in the first degree, conspiracy, corruption of federal office, and abuse of authority. This court sentences you to death by hanging." A murmur ran through the crowd of spectators. Frank felt Ayanna's hand slip into his, her fingers squeezing gently as they watched justice finally being served. Beside them, Elena dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, thinking of her own sister whose death had never seen such justice. The trial had lasted 3 weeks and had become the biggest news story in the Wyoming Territory. Newspapers from as far away as New York had sent reporters to cover the proceedings. The story of the Native American woman who had survived a Wyoming winter to bring down a network of corrupt federal agents had captured the nation's attention. But, more importantly, Brennan's conviction had opened the floodgates for other victims to come forward. The investigation that Captain Morrison had started had grown into a territorial-wide cleanup that resulted in the arrest of 8 other federal officials and the complete reorganization of Indian Affairs administration in the region. "It's over," Ayanna whispered to Frank as they watched Brennan being led away in chains. "Little Dove can finally rest," Frank squeezed her hand. "And you can finally live." The past 6 months had been difficult in many ways. Ayanna had spent weeks traveling between courtrooms, telling her story over and over again to judges, lawyers, and investigators. Each time she had to relive the trauma of her sister's death and her own desperate flight across the frozen prairie. But she had never wavered in her determination to see justice done. Frank had accompanied her to every hearing, every deposition, every court appearance. He had watched her transform from a frightened refugee into a confident woman who spoke truth to power without flinching. Her courage had inspired other victims to come forward, creating a cascade of testimony that had brought down Brennan's entire network, but the legal proceedings had only been part of their journey. Back at the ranch, they had worked together to build something new, not just a cattle operation, but a refuge for others who needed help. Word had spread through both the white and native communities about the place where a cowboy and an Indian woman had stood up to corruption and won. Other women had started arriving at the ranch, some fleeing abusive situations, others simply needing a safe place to recover from trauma. Elena had embraced her role as mother figure to these temporary residents, while Ayanna used her knowledge of traditional medicine and counseling to help them heal. Frank had initially worried about the financial burden of supporting so many extra people, but the ranch had actually prospered. Many of the women who stayed with them had valuable skills: sewing, cooking, animal care, even reading and writing. They had formed a community that was stronger than the sum of its parts. As they left the courthouse that day, Captain Morrison was waiting for them on the steps. The young officer had become a regular visitor to the ranch during the investigation, and Frank had come to consider him a friend. "Congratulations," Morrison said, shaking hands with all 3 of them. "Justice has been served, thanks to your courage." "What happens now, Captain?" Elena asked. "Is the investigation finally complete?" Morrison nodded. This was the last trial. "The cleanup of the Indian Affairs Administration is ongoing, but the criminal cases are finished." He turned to Ayanna. "Miss Ayanna, I want you to know that your testimony has resulted in policy changes at the federal level. New oversight procedures have been put in place to prevent this kind of abuse from happening again." Ayanna smiled, but Frank could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The months of legal proceedings had taken their toll, even though justice had ultimately prevailed. "Captain," Frank said, "what about the other victims?" The families of the women who didn't survive? The government is providing compensation to the families, and there's been talk of establishing a fund to improve conditions on the reservations. It won't bring back the women who died, but it might prevent future tragedies. As they walked back to their hotel, Frank noticed that Ayanna was quieter than usual. That evening, as they sat on the hotel's front porch watching the sunset, he finally asked what was troubling her. "I keep thinking about what comes next," she said softly. "For months, our lives have been focused on this trial, on getting justice for Little Dove and the other women. Now that it's over, I don't know what my purpose is anymore." Frank turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "Ayanna, your purpose is whatever you want it to be. You're free now, free to go anywhere, do anything, be anyone you choose. But where do I belong?" she asked. "I'm not fully white or fully native. The mission school tried to make me white, but I never stopped being Lakota. And now, after everything that's happened, I'm not sure either world would fully accept me." Elena, who had been sitting quietly nearby, spoke up. "Child, you belong wherever you're loved and valued for who you are. And you know you have that at the ranch." Frank felt his heart racing as he realized this was the moment he had been waiting for. "Ayanna, there's something I've been wanting to say to you for months, but the timing never seemed right." She looked at him with curiosity and perhaps a hint of hope. "I love you," Frank said simply. "Not because you're native or despite it, not because you need protection or because you're grateful for help. I love you because you're the strongest, most compassionate person I've ever known. You've made my house into a home and my life into something meaningful." Tears began to flow down Ayanna's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Frank Carter, I fell in love with you the day you found me under that dead horse and chose to save a stranger's life. Everything good that's happened since then started with your kindness." Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. "Then will you marry me? Will you help me build something together that honors both of our traditions?" Ayanna opened the box to find a simple gold ring alongside a traditional Native American silver bracelet. "You want to blend our customs? I want to blend our lives," Frank replied. "Everything else is just details." Elena clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, this is wonderful. We'll have the most beautiful wedding the territory has ever seen." 2 months later, on a crisp October morning, that's exactly what they had. The wedding took place at the ranch, with guests representing both white and native communities. Captain Morrison served as Frank's best man while Elena stood beside Ayanna as her matron of honor. The ceremony itself was conducted by both a Methodist minister and a Lakota elder, blending traditions in a way that honored both cultures. They exchanged vows in English and Lakota, promising to support each other's dreams and protect each other's people, but perhaps the most meaningful moment came when they honored the memory of Little Dove and all the other women who had died at Brennan's hands. Ayanna spoke their names aloud, one by one, asking their spirits to bless the union and to know that their deaths had not been in vain. As the years passed, the ranch continued to serve as a haven for those in need. Frank and Ayanna raised 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son, teaching them to value both strength and compassion, tradition and progress, justice and mercy. The story of the cowboy who found a woman sleeping under a dead horse became legend in Wyoming territory. But those who knew the real story understood that it wasn't about rescue or even revenge. It was about the power of human decency to triumph over evil, and the way love can grow from the seeds of courage. Ayanna never forgot the horse that had sheltered her during the worst night of her life. Every year on the anniversary of that terrible day, she would ride out to the place where Frank had found her and leave wildflowers on the spot where the Mare had died. It was her way of honoring the sacrifice that had made everything else possible. The woman who had once used a dead horse for shelter had become a force for life and healing. And the man who had chosen compassion over convenience had found that sometimes the greatest rewards come from simply doing what's right, regardless of the cost. Together, they proved that true strength isn't about power or violence. It's about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. and never giving up on the belief that justice and love can conquer even the darkest evil.